Securities offered through Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through CWM, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, is under separate ownership from any other named entity. Carson Partners, a division of CWM, LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. This is The Way to Wealth, with host Scott Ford, a jiu-jitsu fighting, woodworking, beekeeping entrepreneur who is also the managing director, partner, and wealth advisor of Carson Wealth. Financial freedom is the goal, and clarity and simplicity is how we'll get there. Let's get to it. This is Way to Wealth.
Excited to have Jonathan Mullins from Tennessee and Virginia back on the podcast. Welcome back to the Way to Wealth podcast, Cub.
Hey, thanks for having me, buddy. I appreciate it. Looking forward to our discussion today.
AKA the Bruce Lee of wealth management.
I mean, when you look at Bruce Lee and you look at me, you have to take a double take.
That's what happens. It's how you got the name, and it came up on our last time together. So it's all good. All good. Well, we talked about what to do a podcast on, and we picked volatility. And so no time like the present. This is getting launched here in June of 2022, and volatility we have had in the market. Now, that said, if you just look in perspective, we've been in this bull market really for the most part since 2009. Now, we've had some corrections and some, I guess you would say, a mini bear along the way, but it was just such a quick recovery out that it just feels abnormal to have volatility like we're having. But in the broader scheme of things, when you look back, I think it's like every 5 years there's a bear market, and every 2 years there's a correction defined as 10% downturn from top to bottom, and then bear market 20%. So it's not abnormal to have volatility. It just is, for over the last decade. So it makes people nervous. The other thing that my friend Tom Dorsey from Dorsey Wright, he used to talk about BST. What the heck is BST? And he called them big, scary things. And when you would look at a year and he would just put on the slide BST, you knew what was coming. And then you would flip the screen and it would be some big, scary thing. The point is, just about every year, there's a BST. It's just when we look back at the big scary thing, it's really sometimes stressful, depending on who you are. But it's like, oh my gosh, this has never happened. Whoa, this is new. We get something like that every year. So it just would help in perspective. So what do we got? Well, we got some BSTs here in 2022. And so we thought it'd be great to talk a little bit about volatility, what's causing the volatility, put it in a perspective without rose-colored glasses, just calling, what is, and then what you can do about it. So with that, Jonathan, would love to hear your thoughts on maybe big scary things and perspective, as well as, what is some of the big scary things happening this year in 2022 that's causing some of this volatility from your perspective.
Sure. BSTs. I love that. That's, at one point I remember walking with my wife in New Orleans, about this time last year. And there was a guy sitting there and he said, you're like the scariest guy that I know, that I think I've ever seen. Because I had sunglasses on just walking by, and I thought, it's because you don't know me. That's just because you don't know me.
Well, you look like Bruce Lee. So it's like, it's kind of intimidating. Just saying.
Right. Hands down. So, just like you said, that, it's something that when you look at it and you don't really know like what's going to happen the next day or the next week or the next month, because we never know what the future is going to hold. And we get a bit of a recency bias sometimes. I mean, that's something where people feel like, hey, the prevailing winds of the day are blowing in a certain direction. It's always going to be in that direction. And when you really look back and you think about all of the changes that we see from year to year to year to year, there's a lot of big, scary things out there that for the most part, may not materialize into anything. And sometimes they do. And then when you think about it over an even longer period of time, you really realize that those big, scary things were just little blurps on the radar. It was just something just for a short period of time that you experienced some pain. And then beyond that, it's, things kind of get back to some sense of normal. And that normal may be a little uncertain. It's always a little uncertain because, again, we don't know what the future is going to hold. But at the same time, we do know that there are a few things that are consistent, and that's that people are consumers. We're always consuming something, whether, we're talking of food, water, energy, housing, travel, things that are important to you, things that are necessities, maybe not necessarily luxuries, but certainly at times there's some luxuries in there too. So yeah, having consistency and knowing that, yes, the sun will rise in the morning and there will be things that need to be done tomorrow, kind of gives a little bit of pause and some comfort to feel like, everyone is experiencing some uncertainty at some level or another, and that we're not alone, because when you feel like you're alone, sometimes that's the scariest thing. So yeah, I think, to kind of play off of that, it's, just trying to do the things that we can do to change our present, to try to make it a little bit more comfortable, to make it so that these uncertain times and these concerns that may be quite a bit right now, and that have also been, lots of concerns in the past. We've made it to where we are right now, and we'll make it forward as well. We've just got to figure out to take control of the things we can control and do the best that we can, and not worry about the things that are outside of our control, because that's a great way to drive yourself crazy, to increase your stress level, and ultimately end you up in an early grave, which is not where any of us want to be. We're going to be there one day. I just want to be there way far in the future. And I know you do too.
Not in a rush for that. Patience is not my strongest attribute, but I have patience with that one, this whole longevity thing. I'll be patient. I think a couple takeaways there, Cub. One is thinking long term. And then when you think of this, balancing it with the way to wealth process, I think the healthy thing is to think in long term, like it used to be. I know you've heard me say this. Indigenous cultures used to talk about, and still do, candidly, 7th generation thinking. They would think in 7 generations. And I do think that's a super healthy way to go about things for so many reasons. But if we just talk about volatility for a second, that's one for sure. And then second, you talked about control. And the way to wealth process is focused on cash flow and control. What can we do to affect the things that we do have control of? Make sure we're allocated and doing things in a way that we're comfortable and fits who we are. And then don't stress about the things that are out of our control. For perspective, so what we're talking about in 2022, a war, inflation that we haven't had to deal with for a long time. Okay. So there's a lot of questions. We're just coming out of COVID. There's a lot of concerns. There's a lot of questions because of it. And I didn't write any of these notes, just going back memory lane for me. So I started in 91, but I really started Cornerstone as far as the wealth management arm in 96. We really focused in on investments and kind of fee-only planning in the late 90s. And so my first market, and if you remember the 90s, the market, you could throw a dart and you're going to make all kinds of money. Then 2000 came, Y2K, and then we had they called the tech wreck, which was 2001 too. And pretty significant market downturn, not to mention 9/11. Again, so just think about that. Like, put yourself back in that spot. Oh my gosh, like this has never happened before. What's this gonna mean? 2008 was another one that we all experienced. Financial crisis. You had names as far as Lehman Brothers and these names that Freddie, Fannie, like this is once in lifetime stuff. Like this is it. Like we're never going to get out of this one. And then I can remember it was around 2011, our rating as a country based off of the debt got downgraded. Oh my gosh, that's unheard of. And then you had Brexit around that time frame. And then COVID just a couple of years ago, like this is a global So we got a war and we have inflation. And all I'm saying is it's a BSD. It's a big, scary thing. And it is. this, hopefully, that was just off the top of my head. I could give so many more examples. That was me just going back memory lane of things that have happened. That was a big, scary thing that in the moment, it's like, oh, we've never had this. History may not completely repeat, but it certainly rhymes. So that just hopefully helps a little bit as far as perspective. So if we think about control, let's talk about the purpose of the way to wealth. Well, the way to wealth is designed to help you have more cash flow and control. And, without going through all the pieces, 3 of the pieces in the way to wealth process are bucketing. How do we have separate segments of money? Talk a little bit about bucketing and how we look at allocating monies via buckets, via the way to wealth, Cub.
Right. Great point. And one of the things I was just going to mention, since you were going through our history there, now that we've got the war in Ukraine with the Russians, it's really, I don't know if there's an increase of the movie Rocky IV, where he had to fight Ivan Drago, but that's a good one for those that
it is a good one. Yes.
Good movie buffs there.
No, I'm not a movie buff, but I even remember that one.
It's iconic. You can't get away from it. So
yes.
So yeah, back to bucketing is a wonderful thing that and we've got an article coming out in our newsletter here about that as well, that I wrote to kind of talk about how and why it's so important, because it helps keep you on track. We talk through different time segments of money. So we've got our first bucket, our savings bucket. That is the most important bucket of all of them, because that's the one that we're going to be using and we're going to be leaning on for the next 12 months. So we want to keep that, secure, accessible, liquid. That's where you're getting your current paychecks from. So that is the most important bucket, because we know we're here today. We're not promised our next breath. That's something we had to learn through COVID. I mean, that's really a scary reality that, and just with mental health in our world right now, you mentioned the wars. We mentioned a lot of people who had major plans that maybe started retirement or what have you. And then all of a sudden now they've gotten sick and they may not be here anymore. And it's like, life's a precious thing, and time is one of the things that no matter how many assets you have, you're never going to get any more than you're going to get. Time is what you've got. So when we think through that first bucket, making sure we've got enough to get through that next year, that we don't have to worry about any volatility with what's going on with interest rates or what's going on with markets or the price of beans in China or whatever it may be. And that used to be an old adage. I don't know if we can talk about commodities and so forth, like beans and such, but yeah, just the things that we've got to get through today. We're going to plan for tomorrow. And I think our process, just the way to wealth means so much, because we talk about the things that are the most important first. And, within our industry, sometimes it's so frustrating to hear people talk about, well, this is what it's going to look like in 20 years. Well, no one knows what it's going to look like in 20 years. Let's focus on the things that are important to us right now, being able to do and live and experience as much as we can today, because we don't know how many tomorrows we have. So number one, planning on making sure we've got that bucket taken care of. And then the second bucket, our income bucket. That's the one where we know after we spend that first year's worth of income, we're probably going to need some more. So we need to make sure we've got money set aside, invested in a conservative manner, so that we can take income from that and replenish our spending needs for the following year, and then the one after that, and the one after that. And ideally, we like to have about 10 years worth of income in that bucket. So that way we know with whatever's left over is our long-term money. That's our growth bucket. That's where we want to make sure we're taking all of that market risk that we know over the long term works out really well, because you mentioned all of these scary BSTs that are lurking out there that have happened already, and that who knows what's going to come, but there's going to be some BSTs out there in the future too. There always will be. There's always going to be that uncertainty. But when you think about the time that it takes for a long-term investment strategy to become profitable on ideally 100% basis, that we're looking at 10 plus years, 15 plus years, ideally, for a diversified allocation. That's, not all the eggs in one basket, because there's multiple different ways to skin the cat. And we want to make sure that we're not leaning or depending on one particular thing, whether it be a company or what have you. Just being in a position to where we can have that ownership and over the long term, be able to then replace the income that we're using over the next 10 years. And then the next 10 years, and so forth and so on. So the way that we've designed this has been in a manner, and in the article, not to give anything away, I refer to it as hiding the peas inside the mashed potatoes. So any of those out there that have children or have had children or were a child, I hope that covers everyone. So if you were a child, you have a child, you think about having a child, at some point, you're going to want to make sure that they have the right nutrition. I hope it's as soon as you get them. But as they get older and you've got the peas there on the plate and they don't want to eat them because they don't taste good. But if we put those peas inside some mashed potatoes, we can choke them down and we can get that nutrition that we need. So the way to tie that back into our bucketing is that none of us like volatility on the downside. We love it when it goes up. We love when we see the growth bucket grow like leaps and bounds. It's a wonderful feeling. Now, when it pulls back a little bit, it doesn't feel really well. Well, the good news is when you have a disciplined approach and you know that these are funds that you're not using today or tomorrow or really within potentially the next decade, the good feeling there is that you've got plenty of mashed potatoes to eat along the way so that you don't have to worry about tasting that terrible flavor of volatility and how that may potentially affect your lifestyle going forward.
Yeah. So the peas, first of all, you may have become now the Rocky Balboa of wealth management with the Rocky Russia, fight analogy. Just saying, we'll see how that plays out. And I'm not sure I knew about the whole peas and the potato analogy. However, the giving medicine to an animal, like a dog as an example, or a big old mastiff, was like put the medicine in a hot dog. You cut up a hot dog or a piece of cheese or a piece of chicken or whatever, stick it in there and looky there, chomp, chomp, medicine down, and never even knew it. So that could be another way to think about it. If you don't have kids or never were a kid, not sure how that works, but just saying, think about the dog analogy as well. You know what I think of this, Cub, like the way to wealth. We talk about the foundation because what can you control? Well, first of all, you can control foundation. Like if you do tax planning and you save on taxes, minimize your insurance premiums, maximize the coverage, proper estate planning, interest rate, make those efficient, credit review, like all these things are in our control, which should lead to more cash flow and control. Today, we're talking about volatility, which is an investment piece, but it's three buckets for savings, income, growth. Savings is different than investing, but most people don't make that distinction. We do, as you clearly articulated and put in your article. We like a minimum 12 months. In fact, that's really what we say, is a requirement. And then the income, 10 years. And then growth, you can swing for the fences, right? So if you're listening to this podcast and you just think about allocating in a way, you have 12 months liquid, readily available in cash, you have income cover for 10 years, and growth is 10 years plus. To me, that's a good perspective when you have big, scary things going on because you're allocated in that manner. I'll add, we're all different. We all have our own unique investor DNA. Well, what's that mean and why does it matter? Well, what it means is some may want 10 years of income in the cash bucket. Some may want 100% of their expenses covered for the rest of their life via the income bucket, not 10 years. And then they go to growth. That's cool because we're all different on what we're comfortable with and what we really want. And so just knowing that helps you allocate or your advisor allocate in such a way that you pass what I call the sleep test, sleep factor. However, we need to allocate savings, income, and growth. And whether what do we use in bucket one? What do we use in the income? We'll talk about, but it needs to be done in such a manner that we pass your sleep factor test. That's my belief.
Right. I couldn't agree more. Anything that's robbing you of your peace is too expensive. Anything that's out there is the cost is too high. So having a taking a proactive approach to problem solving and ideally problem prevention. If you can prevent something, I know there's the old adage, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And that's so true. It's
Yeah.
so true. I mean, there's a lot of these little quips of knowledge and wisdom that are out there that people may have heard. If they haven't, then keep your ears open, because that's there's wisdom out there, especially from those that have been before us. A lot of exposure there. So
yeah, keep your ears open, because Cove has shared a lot of things that I have never heard of before, and so keep your ears open, because he may drop some things that you've never heard of before as well.
I was expecting you to say, I love peas. I don't know what you're talking about. Peas are delicious.
Exactly.
My mother-in-law loves peas. She's like, I just love them. Like, well, that's great.
Well, then you don't have to put them in your mashed potatoes.
Right. No need for potatoes. You can be, a little lower carbs now. Good for you.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I get it. I like peas too, but I like all food. So, it's all good.
Me too, unfortunately.
So if you think of allocating, so as I mentioned, some may want 50% of their portfolio in the cash, and
right.
Whatever it takes to have income the rest of your life in bucket 2, and then look for growth. It's all different. What are some options? And let's say saving, because there's so many options in the growth piece, but let's just say for the savings and specifically the income bucket, what options are available? How do you think about taking care of your expenses being covered by your income? And as you said, we like to see at least 10 years covered. What are some options for people to be aware of for that income piece?
Right. So, ideally more on the conservative side. So we like to show income producing investments for income. Now that may be, we could look at designing fixed income ladders where you've got maturities that are coming through, likely every year. So if we had a 10-year ladder, whether that be in, guaranteed issue fixed incomes or something that may be a little bit more fluctuating based on interest rates, and also being aware that interest rates can fluctuate and that can potentially have some good or some negative effects. Those are some things to be aware of. In a rising rate environment like we're seeing now, there are some pressure on longer term bonds, more so than shorter term, bonds. There's other ways to look at a lot of that. So that's one way of looking at doing it. Another way is pushing that interest rate risk off on someone else, on another institution. So we could look at guaranteed issued items, in different banks and credit unions potentially. Insurance companies, we found that there's a lot of success to be looking forward through in fixed indexed annuities, because we've got the ability to get a little bit higher, somewhat of a variable return. In that variable meaning that we can't necessarily lose money unless we take out more than we're supposed to, and would have to pay surrender charges or interest penalties, the way you could look at it in one sense of the term. But you could also participate somewhat more so in markets than you would be if you wanted to lock it in with like a bank or credit union. You may be locking it in at a very low rate for a very long period of time when you think about things over a long period of time. Or you could be in something that gives you some flexibility, has some downside protection, hopefully some more upside over the period of time, but you can still get to it. You can still pull those distributions out. And ideally, there may be even some out there that have some income components after that 10-year time period. One thing you mentioned that I thought was great, is that people are different. Everyone has their own individual wants and needs and things that make them feel good, and the things that can give them peace and tranquility and allow them to sleep through the night without having to worry about what the next day holds, or the next month or year, or what have you. So having assets that are positioned where you don't have to worry about a lot of these outside forces that are affecting portfolios right now, can be a bigger concern. The other thing that's real interesting and also super important that you mentioned there earlier was just with tax planning. Sometimes when markets and central banks give you lemons, then we can turn them into lemonades. Looking at what we have in those tax deferred accounts, anything that you've got in those pre-taxed IRA accounts, those retirement accounts, 401ks, deferred compensation plans, what have you. At some point, you're going to have to pull those out, either when you turn 72 at the latest right now. And I know there's some legislation in Congress that it may be even later than that. But right now, the law reads that once you turn 72, you have to take about 3.65% of the previous year's ending account value out of that retirement account at some point in the next 12 months. So the year your 72nd birthday, congratulations. If you're not using your retirement assets at that point, you're going to have to then. You can do a couple different things with it, though. If you want to try to reduce your taxes, you can give it away. If you're charitably inclined, if you have a church or a charity that you contribute to or what have you, you can give to that without having additional income taxation to yourself. But you can also satisfy the required minimum distribution at that point in time. That's a wonderful thing. The other side of it is, during periods of volatility, if you're not at that age yet, you've got the ability to do some Roth conversions. And even if you are at that age, you've got to first satisfy the required minimum distribution amount. Once you do that, you can then do Roth conversions if if that's something that's important to you. If you've got a history of long living family members in your past, if you've got folks that are in their 90s or triple digits and so forth, then the likelihood of you living that long certainly is better than some. Whether or not that you make it there, no one knows. But at the same time, it's good to think through some of these things and look at how the planning affects it and going from there. But for those that are still working, this is a great time when we think about the history of just the tax rates. Right now we've got the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that's going to expire here at the end of 2025. At that point, we revert back to the previous system, and that may not be as advantageous as it is right now. So depending on where you are, what your age is, whether you're trying to, or you're about to go into Social Security or Medicare, what have you, there may be some reasons now, more so than in years previously, to look at doing some conversions and paying the tax on that money today, or this year rather, versus waiting until later on when it could potentially be a higher taxed amount.
Yeah, that's helpful, Cub. So my additions to the income bucket would just be thinking through options, i.e., you mentioned bonds, and again, could be a laddered bond portfolio. Several different ways to play bonds, and of course, people are like, "Oh my gosh, are you kidding? Bonds right now in a rising interest rate environment?" Yes, and just to think through how do you minimize that risk. But bonds, purely income option that I'm referring to. Second could be an option writing strategy. So you could be writing options on a stock portfolio, covered rights, or different option writing strategies to generate income. Doesn't mean there's not going to be volatility in the stock price. I'm just giving another example of ways to produce income. You mentioned if someone wanted some guarantees. Well, the way to go guarantees, typically insurance companies, you're putting that risk on them, and could be, indexed annuities, equity indexed annuities, or something like that. You mentioned another could be real estate. Another could be which maybe could be favorable in a rising interest rate environment. Another could be business. Businesses produce income. So could you invest in private business or dividend paying stocks, as an example? So just some more. What I would stress there is focusing in on what you feel strongest about, or you understand the best, or you are most comfortable with. So there are just some options. The other thing I would say is, you could leverage the savings bucket with cash, because that's the key. Another way would be, and we talked about this on prior podcast, structuring your own style type bank. And we use a dividend paying whole life with a mutual company there that you can borrow against. And then the benefit there is, you're thinking long term, but then you can leverage that, borrow against it for opportunities of buying real estate or buying businesses, or let your mind can expand and be infinite in the possibilities there. So just some other things to think about. And really, for me, I would look to wrap this particular podcast up on three things. If I were to take away three things here, I would say long term, which helps forget about big, scary things. And I want to preface that. I want to mention something about that. Number two, control, focusing on what you can control. And you've gave lots of different options on things we can control, from converting. In other words, there's always options and opportunities, focusing in on those. You gave several great options. And then 3, a process. Can I focus on long-term? How do I do that? What's in my control that I can do? And then 3, what's the process I'm going to implement, whether it's yours, a firm you're working with, or whatever that looks like, making sure there's a process in place. Because I think they're the key 3 things in volatility or in anything for success. The only add-on I wanted to make to the long-term is I'm not talking about we stick this under the pillow and forget about it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying thinking long-term is a healthy perspective, and the way to wealth is living today. So we all we have is today. You already mentioned that earlier. So, I mean, you got to balance that out. I'm simply saying thinking long-term is healthy. So I'm not saying let's just set it and forget it. And 30 years from now, you're going to be great, because I don't believe in that. Anything else, Cub, that you would want to add as we look to wrap up?
You mentioned using like an option strategy with dividend paying companies. I think that's a huge one there as well. A lot of that, just depends on your comfort with volatility too. If we're using those dividends for income, I think that's great. I think ultimately, and I've talked about this a lot with clients and in client meetings, when you think about having stability, think of a stool. Milkmaids had a stool that had 2 legs on it. I don't know if you knew that or not. But if you're milking cows, it's good to have a stool with 2 legs. That way, you've got to kind of be a little bit more in balance there. You can't just sit down on the thing, because it's going to throw you off.
Have you done that, Cub?
Sit down on a 2-legged stool?
Yeah.
Or milk cows, or both?
Both.
I've seen it done.
Okay, good enough.
I avoided the stool. I looked at that and I said, I don't feel like I'm certified for that. Of course, my dad laughed at me and was like, just do it anyway. And then I was like, I don't know that this is really the approach we should take here. But that's a story for another podcast. Okay,
fair enough.
But the point about that is, when you think about that 2-legged stool, thinking about income. Maybe you have Social Security, maybe it's your employment income, maybe it's your gig mentality, maybe your side hustle, or whatever's going on here. But the more legs that you have on that stool, the more safe and secure you feel. So when we think about our income bucket and the strategies for income over the next 10 years, it's not a one solution fits the entire bill. Maybe it's multiple solutions. There's a lot of ways to look at this to say, okay, what can we do? Like you say, planning for the long term. Let's look out and forecast. What about inflation in the future? Long-term averages are somewhere around 3%. We're not there yet. We're showing 7-8% right now. It may get a little higher. We hope not, but it may. There's possibility. It could happen. What can we do to say, well, we may know we need this amount of money in the next 10 years, but let's throw in higher inflation. Well, maybe we're going to need some more now. So what are ways where we can invest and position ourselves so that we can avoid a lot of those pitfalls that if, some of our fears actually become reality. So I think what's important here is to think about, yes, let's look at getting as many legs on our stool as we can for now, for the future, and for the intermediate term too. So that's what I mentioned as far as the more legs you have on your stool, the better off that you're, the more stability you have. So
makes sense to me. Legs on the stool. So we'll run this back again, no doubt. Having Jonathan Mullins back on the podcast, Bruce Lee, Rocky Balboa of Wealth Management. It's been a pleasure as usual, exactly, and stool milking cow as well. So all good, Cub. Thanks for joining. And look, we'll catch you guys next week on the Way to Wealth podcast, where we're all about making money simple, allowing you to focus on living fully and doing that now, not 30 years from now. Catch you next week.
The opinions voiced in Way to Wealth with Scott Ford, Managing Director, Partner, and Wealth Advisor of Carson Wealth, are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial, or tax advisor prior to investing. Legato Family is not affiliated with Cetera Advisor Networks, LLC, or CWM, LLC. Carson Wealth, 19833, Leitersburg Pike, Suite 1, Hagerstown, Maryland, 21742.